So I'll get right into it. I, 25, male, brought home a puppy when I was 18. He's a rescued beagle and is named Jerry. He's my best friend and I do anything for him like any other pet owner. Back then, I still lived with my parents, so when I brought him home, there was a lot of resistance from them because they don't like animals. They don't have any allergies or past trauma related to animals, they just don't like them. But I convinced them to let me keep Jerry because he was a timid little puppy and I couldn't just go back to the rescue center and return him. It had been a spur-of-the-moment decision to bring him home, and I'll admit, I should have talked to my parents about it first because I live with them, but I couldn't undo it once I brought Jerry home. So I talked them into it, promised that I would take care of him all on my own and wouldn't let him bother them in the slightest. After a few weeks, they accepted Jerry since they knew that I wasn't going to give up. Ever since then, Jerry and I have been the best of friends, and I really couldn't imagine my life without him. I believed that my parents would come around and fall in love with him too eventually, but that didn't happen. Even after a year had passed, they still didn't like him and avoided him as much as they could. I already knew that my parents don't like animals, so I tried to keep Jerry away from them and I stuck to my promise of not letting him bother them, even though it used to kind of hurt me. Anyway, about a year after I'd brought Jerry home, I was going to visit my grandparents, and I couldn't bring Jerry along because he got really agitated while traveling. He didn't even like short car rides, and my grandparents lived quite far away, so it would be out of the question to take him along with me. Every time I visited my grandparents, I would ask a friend of mine to take care of Jerry, but unfortunately, that time that friend wasn't around. He had left for college a couple of weeks before that, and I really didn't trust anyone else to take care of Jerry for 2 weeks. While I didn't like the idea of asking my parents to take care of him while I was gone, that was the only option I had. So I had to beg them for days before I left to take care of Jerry, and they protested at first, but then they agreed to it quite unwillingly. They were my only option because I didn't trust the other alternatives as much, so I had to leave Jerry with them to go visit my grandparents. I kept in touch with them throughout the 2 weeks that I spent with my grandparents, and I would regularly ask them to put me on FaceTime with Jerry. They did it for the first couple of days, but towards the end, they started dodging that question with weird excuses. They told me that Jerry was sleeping in my room and they didn't want to bother him. Then they said my dad had taken him out for a walk and he wouldn't be back for a while. And then finally, they got annoyed at me and told me not to ask for FaceTime with Jerry because it was entitled of me to make such demands. They said that they were already tired from work and didn't need me pushing them to put me on FaceTime with my dog because it was even more work. So I stopped because I didn't want to bother them too much, but I should have figured out that there was something off then itself. I came back home about a few days ago and I received the shock of my life when I realized that Jerry was nowhere to be found in the house. I still remember that day because of how awful it was. Literally, the first thing that I asked my parents as soon as I entered the house was, "Where's Jerry?" And they told me to look for myself. So I turned the house upside down but still couldn't find him, and I realized then that something was very wrong. So I confronted my parents about it and they told me that they put Jerry up for sale and someone had taken him off their hands a few days before I returned. And that's why they hadn't been able to put Jerry on FaceTime with me in the last few days of my stay at my grandparents' place. They told me that they had tried their best to take care of him, but it was just a lot of work, and so they decided that it was for the best if they gave him up. I couldn't believe it. And we got into a horrible fight that day, after which I left their house and never went back. I did get Jerry back, though, thankfully. I put up a post on social media and requested my friends to circulate it until we could find the person who had Jerry. Luckily, we were able to find them within a couple of days, and I was quite relieved to know that the family who had purchased Jerry was a good one, and he had a nice home. But I couldn't live without my Jerry, so I had to get him back. I had to buy him back from the family, and I'm always going to be so grateful that they didn't put up much of a fight to keep Jerry. When I told them the story of what happened, they were stunned, and since they were nice people, I got Jerry back soon after. I never talked to my parents again after I left that house, not even to ask them to pay me the money that they had received by selling Jerry. I needed it, but it was way beneath my dignity. The years after that were pretty difficult for me because I didn't have a college education, so it was hard for me to find jobs. But going to college wasn't part of the plan for me anyway. I'd planned that I'd join my dad's business after school, but since that didn't work out, I had to pave my own way, and I guess it was for the best. I'd been working since I was 16, so I had some money saved and a lot of friends who were willing to let me stay with them and take turns helping me out, and that is how I survived and narrowly avoided ending up homeless with a dog. I was just going from one low-paying job to another for a few years until I finally landed a decent receptionist position at the firm I'm still employed at. I was a diligent worker, and somehow I managed to get promoted to the assistant of the manager when the previous guy in the position quit. My manager and I got along well, and it probably helped that his daughter was interested in me. So that was almost 4 years ago, and since then my life has completely changed for the better. I'd say most of the credit goes to my girlfriend because, like I said, she had a huge role to play in me getting promoted to assistant. She's the one who talked to her dad and convinced him to hire me for the position, partly because she was in HR and knew I could greatly benefit from this, and partly because it was a family-owned business and she had a lot of sway in how everything runs. But mostly because she liked me and asked me out shortly after I was promoted. We've been together since then and moved in 3 years ago, and she got pregnant last year. We have a beautiful baby boy just 4 months old, and we already know I'm going to love him more than life itself. Jerry is also still a huge part of our lives, even though he's considerably older now. My girlfriend and I aren't married yet, but I'm going to ask her in a couple of months. Everything's going great for us. And then my parents reached out to me a week ago after almost 7 years of no contact. They messaged me on Facebook and said that they wanted to bury the hatchet, mostly because they had seen pictures of my son and they wanted to meet their grandson. My parents apologized for whatever they did back then and acknowledged that it was insensitive of them. They said that they just didn't realize how important Jerry was to me because neither of them had ever had pets and didn't particularly like animals, so they had no idea how it felt to have one and love them to bits. But after I left, they thought about it and they realized that it was their own fault. They said that they felt sorry about what happened and wanted to reach out to me several times to let me know that they were sorry but never found the courage to actually do it. However, when they saw our relatives sharing photos of my son with them, they couldn't hold back anymore, and they knew that they had to talk to me and clear the air. So that's why they had reached out to me and were now asking for forgiveness and the chance to make everything right again. I didn't know how to feel about that message, so I talked to my girlfriend who knew about my history with my parents. She suggested that we first hop onto a phone call or something less personal and talk about this to feel things out before meeting in person or introducing them to my son. I thought that was a good idea, so I told them the same thing, and a couple of days back, I finally talked to them on a phone call and heard their voices after almost 7 years. It was going well initially, and we were catching up on lost time. I told them all about my girlfriend and my new life as a dad and how difficult it had been for me to survive on my own, living off of my friends before I met her. They were pretty impressed. They also told me that it had been really lonely without me in the years following my exit, and they had been miserable after I left. But they're a little too old and egoistic to admit that they made a mistake and apologized to me. It was quite emotional, but then we started talking about the day I left and the fight that we had before I walked out. It was a difficult conversation, but I brought up how terrible I felt that day after I learned that they had the single most important thing in my life, because they believed that it was apparently too much work to take care of him. They agreed with it and they could have just left it at that. But they went on to say that they had apologized for it. But they didn't quite agree with the fact that it was entirely their fault and I had to take some accountability as well. I didn't understand what they were getting at. So they told me that it was kind of my fault as well, because when I brought Jerry home, I hadn't exactly asked them if they would be okay with it. And since I was still living with them at the time, I should have discussed this with them before taking the leap. So it really shouldn't have come as a surprise when they decided that they didn't want to take care of Jerry anymore and ended up selling him. I could understand where they were coming from about them wanting me to discuss it with them before I brought a dog home, but it still didn't excuse them for selling Jerry just because I wasn't at home for 2 weeks. So that led to another argument, and they told me that if I really cared about Jerry as much as I claimed I did, then I wouldn't have left him with two people who clearly didn't have any interest in taking care of him and only wanted the dog out of the house. So our phone call ended on a pretty sour note, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about what they said since then. Maybe I was a bad owner. AITA for bringing a dog back home without discussing it with my parents first. Edit. Hey guys, so I think there might have been some confusion regarding my relationship. I don't know why it's become such a bone of contention among people when that wasn't even the most important part of the post. But nevertheless, let me just talk about it and clear the air before people start jumping to their own conclusions. So my girlfriend handled the HR department in her father's company and still does because it's a family-owned business. I don't think there's anything odd about it. And she definitely wasn't misusing her influence to try and get me the job. I was one of the candidates who had applied for it, and I had the skills for it too. It just helped that my girlfriend talked me up to her father. And when she asked me out, I didn't owe it to her to agree to a date. And I didn't agree to go out with her because she got me the assistant job. I didn't even know about it until much later, and she only told me once we had been together for almost 6 months. So she definitely didn't manipulate me into going out with her, like a lot of you have been suggesting. And it's frankly really insulting because she and I have been together for a really long time now. She's the mother of my child, and she is pretty much my guardian angel because I don't think my life would have turned around the way it did had it not been for her. She doesn't see it that way and never uses it against me because she is one of the kindest and purest people I know. So I'll be thankful if people don't question her intentions. And also, some of you have been asking why we haven't gotten married yet. The reason is pretty simple. My girlfriend's parents went through a very nasty divorce when she was younger, and so she doesn't exactly believe in marriage. We have talked about it at length, and she says that when she feels ready, she'll let me know. So I'm just waiting for her to give me a sign. Otherwise, I'm all for marrying her, and I definitely wouldn't want to wait because I love her. Now that all queries about my girlfriend and our relationship have been laid to rest, I hope that people of Reddit can focus on the real issue here. So thank you very much to everyone who's actually talked about my parents and not my girlfriend. Update 1. I hadn't spoken to my girlfriend about my conversation with my parents when I made the post, but after reading the comments, I decided that it would be best for us to discuss it before I jumped to any conclusions. She heard me out, and once I was done talking, she told me that since this was my parents that I was talking about, it was up to me what I wanted to do, and she didn't feel comfortable pushing me to do what she wanted. I could sense that she knew this was sensitive territory for me and didn't want to say something wrong. But I asked what her personal opinion was, and only then did she tell me that she felt that my parents were just trying to shift the blame onto me because they didn't want to live with the guilt anymore. And it was easier to blame me than to acknowledge that what they had done was insensitive, stupid, and downright heartless. To give away a dog that your son loves is pretty much the epitome of how selfish parents can be. Their reasons were also quite invalid because I only expected them to take care of Jerry for 2 weeks, and once I was back, it would be all my responsibility once more. The only thing that they had to do was walk him and feed him. I didn't even expect them to play with him while I was gone because that would be asking for too much. And yet they couldn't even do that much for me. They just gave him away like he meant nothing. And if they were willing to sell my dog without thinking about my feelings, then that meant that I didn't mean anything to them either, and my feelings didn't matter to them. It was true, because my parents had always been kind of self-centered. I don't think they were selfless enough to become good parents in the first place, but still chose to have me because that's what people expected of them. And then there was the fact that they didn't try to reach out to me even once in the past couple of years. I could have been homeless for all they knew, but to them it was more important to be right than to be kind. And that went for everything. Even now, as they were trying to reconcile with me, they still couldn't accept their own fault and were still trying to pin the blame onto me somehow. She told me that if she was in my place, then she probably wouldn't talk to them anymore, especially after that phone call, because they made it evident that it was more important for them to prove that they were right than to reconcile with me or to see their grandson. Even now, after almost 7 years, they were still hung up on it and were probably always going to be stuck there, trying to convince me that I was the irresponsible and selfish one here. And even if I admitted that I had been kind of selfish and irresponsible by bringing Jerry home without talking about it first, they would never admit that it was heartless of them to give Jerry up for sale without talking to me first. And everybody knew that what they did was much worse than what I did. So they can hold on to the illusion that they were right and I will just move on with my life and pretend that that phone call never even took place. I don't want them back in my life. Update 2. Today I blocked my parents' number. They had been trying to text me and talk to me even after whatever they said on the phone the other day. I had been trying to think of a way to let them know that I didn't want to talk to them anymore and that I was done with them. They didn't deserve a second chance. Their messages were pretty infuriating considering that they were the ones who had been the most selfish and inconsiderate parents. They kept trying to play the victim and brought up everything that they had done for me when I was a kid. They were really pulling out all the stops to make themselves look better and probably feel better after how our last conversation had gone. I honestly don't even understand what their point is because the things that they were talking about were things that every parent does. It doesn't make them special or better than anyone else. For instance, sending me to private school and making sure that they always gave me whatever I asked for on my birthdays isn't exactly the brag that they think it is. And it definitely isn't doing anything to make me feel thankful. All it does is make me think about how materialistic they're being. It's great that they were able to provide for me as a kid, but that doesn't mean that I have to forgive them for what they did to me as an adult. I don't think that they understand that treating me decently as a child doesn't just make everything better magically. I've been thinking of a way to tell them to stop messaging me for a few days, but today I gave up and blocked them. I don't owe it to them to be nice and let them down gently. I don't have to inform them before cutting them out of my life once more, just like they didn't feel the need to inform me before selling Jerry. So I blocked them and I'm done with them now. My girlfriend thinks that this was the right thing to do because if I actually texted them and told them that I was going to stop talking to them, then that would lead to another fight and more explanations. It would just be never-ending mess, and it's better for me to get out of it while I'm ahead of myself. Update 3. Hi, so my parents didn't give up on trying to contact me after I blocked him, and they found a new way to get to me. They contacted a bunch of our relatives and told them to text me and unblock them. Most people were well aware of what had happened in the past, so they didn't bother to text me. And one of my cousins informed me that this is what they were telling people in hopes that this would somehow get me to unblock them. They were sending everybody texts that said that they needed their help and were counting on them to make me realize what a huge mistake I was making by going no contact with them yet again. They wanted my relatives to tell me that my parents would be waiting for my apology for blocking them without any reason, even after everything that they had done for me. And the way that they had reached out to me first after 7 years, especially because the fight was my fault, and yet they let go of their ego and contacted me. So it was good to know that they were completely backtracking on that apology and were now pretending like none of it was their fault. I knew that they thought using my relatives to manipulate me would work, but it just made me realize how far they were willing to go to prove that they were not the bad guys here. And in doing so, they were just doubling down on what people already believed about them. Most of our family, with a few exceptions, believed that my parents were irresponsible and mean and didn't like them. By reaching out to them and trying to get them on their side now, they were just reinforcing what people already believed about them. Whatever, it was their loss, and most people didn't want to get caught up in this drama, so they were all staying out of it. I had been informed of what my parents were trying to do, and that was about it. Nobody tried to change my mind, so it pretty much backfired on them. I just hope that they stop trying now and get the hint that I'm not interested in speaking to them and making things right with them. Not now and not ever. Update 4. Hi, so quick update. 4 months have passed now, and my girlfriend and I are engaged now. So that's great news. My parents didn't try to contact me anymore after that last update, but what they did do was talk crap about me to all our relatives and get themselves ostracized from the family. I have to say, they played it brilliantly and shot themselves in the foot with their own stupidity. We are not going to invite them to the wedding for obvious reasons, but it's still going to be the greatest day of my life. My girlfriend has spoken to her parents and they agreed to take care of the baby on the day of the wedding since the two of us would be a little too busy that day. And we're going to have a very special ring bearer. You guessed it right, it's going to be Jerry. My old boy has already started his training to be the ring bearer, and I can't wait to see what happens on the day of the wedding. The preparations are in full swing, and I really can't wait to spend the rest of my life with the woman I love and my wonderful little son. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.